どうもありがとうございます。Okay. All right. You guys coming?
Excited to be here.
Good. Sure, yes. Yeah, I've got a whole camera bag here. I can talk about that. I'll mention in the doc, I mostly do field photography and living animals and stuff like that. But I will talk a little bit about some of the equipment for stacking images, for ovarium specimen photography, setting up a white background studio kind of setup inside of a collection space, things like that. I'm trying to gear it more to that and less, but these are all fun wildlife to do. But yeah, I'll be curious what people kind of want to hear about, and we can talk about that. Yeah, well, there you go. So, what's that? Lighting, excellent. We'll cover lighting. We'll do a whole thing on lighting. And yeah, we'll go.
Did you bring some camera?
Yeah. There's
really?
I've got a
Nikon?
flash.
Yeah.
This is all Nikon.
Nikon Z8?
Nikon gear. I have the D500 and I left it.
D500.
I left it in my car. I have the Z6 III.
I see.
That just came out with the long lens. Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah.
This
This
is
is Sony one.
Excellent. We'll do a whole camera gear breakdown,
Very
things like
nice.
that.
Interesting.
Recommendations for both field and studio technique. And again, I'll query everybody before we start as to the level of camera expertise, because I'm starting at a very, very low level. But it's very clear here that about half this audience, it looks like, are professional photographers and already are really, really good at this. So it's good. I'll start from the basics and just see where we can. Yeah, the salad, or not the salad. This was the
my
one that's
photo,
from
from Japan.
from Japan, yeah.
And
And
I
big
also
beetles, things like
was
that. These were the product photos of the
right. How to say
So
that?
good.
Japanese beetle.
Yeah. So see, this presentation is you're a pro. You could teach this already.
No. I'm really looking for this session.
Yeah. Cool.
Because usually I took the photo of the how to say specimen, mainly because I'm honestly I'm how to say postdoc of the data management, but I'm also the taxonomist, so I usually took the photo like that. So
we'll talk a little bit about lighting and
writing
all
is
sorts of
very
things like
difficult
that.
and
Oh, it's so hard. Yeah. The product photography is essentially what a lot of us
especially
do.
such kind of how to say the voice discipline is very difficult to take in photo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And having shadow and real shiny specimens like that, it's really, really difficult. That's a great shot. So, as I say, I'll talk about field stuff if folks are interested in more well-lit, presentable, identifiable photos for iNaturalists, for example.
Yeah.
But also these are sort of evocative photos for outreach, things like that. So there's lots of people enjoy the visual communication that you can do through a museum.
Do you have a plan to talking about diffuser also?
Yes, yeah.
Very nice.
I brought some different
really
examples
interesting in
and stuff
that.
like that. Yeah, so
What kind of diffuser?
I'll pull out my field one that I
very nice.
like to do.
So, I'm sorry.
Yes, are we on time?
No, I would like to make sure that there's no person online, right?
Yes, there's no other, just me. Just me.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is one of the ones that I like to use for speedbox diffusers.
Interesting. Oh,
Little softbox. This works well in the field, so
I see. Box.
comes with me in my
Yep.
pack. So lots of different ways to do that. I also make my own diffusion material. I'll show you that. It's a lot of duct tape and a lot of trial and error, just figuring things out. But this one that was lit with like 12 flashes. We can talk about high-speed flash photography if people are interested in that. Yeah, we'll be good to go. So excellent, thank you guys. We'll go ahead and get started. Got another minute or so. Good, I'm glad we have a few folks in. All right. I'll make sure I talk into the microphone so everyone online can hear me. Okay. Good. Alrighty, we can keep playing this is good. Yeah, that's great. Excellent. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Make sure on time. Good. Okay. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you so much to the tech team for help here, getting me up and going. My name is Ian Wright. I'm with the Museum of Riverside, a small municipal museum in Southern California, sort of next to LA. Is basically the closest you can think about it. We are right next to UC Riverside. If people are familiar with the UC system, there's a campus in Riverside that is actually probably usually the #2 or #1 entomology department on the planet, really. So that's the claim to fame, and we're down the street from them. Nothing to do with UC Riverside, but we are a small municipal museum that focuses a lot on outreach. We have a cultural history collection. We have a lot of archive collection. And I'm the natural history curator there, overseeing a few thousand, probably fewer than 100,000 specimens. But I worked for UC Riverside Entomology. I've worked in herpetology programs. And I do a lot of photography in my private interest, and I've merged that with some of my professional interests as well. Helping to set up imaging studios for herbaria at UC Riverside, insect collections all across Southern California, wet collections at UT Austin and various places throughout Texas where I did my graduate work. So I've been doing photography for a long while. Most of my skill set and expertise and interest is in wildlife photography, living creatures and being in the field. So maybe not directly relevant to sort of collections photography, which is quite a bit different or can be different. So we'll talk about all of that and we'll start from the basics. It's very clear to me that a lot of folks here are already excellent photographers or probably already have imaging setups up and going. But we'll definitely talk about those, talk about lighting. And my goal with this workshop is to just make it more question and answer. I have some demonstration material if people want to try out flash photography and flash basics for lighting, controlling the settings on their camera. Did anybody bring a camera today? Excellent. All righty, go ahead and whip it out. And if you guys have any questions, we can literally just kind of go through manuals or what does this button do or anything like that. Most of the photography, collections photography work that I've helped set up has been with curators that are, phenomenal botanists or excellent herpetologists, but can barely use an iPhone. So it's been helpful to have someone with some knowledge there to be able to kind of explain f-stop, controlling aperture, controlling lighting, as well as all the post-processing and things like that, which I won't get too deep into here. But so this workshop is a little more geared toward entry level, but we can breeze through that if everybody's pretty familiar with that. So I will start off by asking, people have a camera. How many people have an SLR or a mirrorless interchangeable lens camera or have used those in collections? Yeah, DSLR and something that's bigger than a cell phone, something like this. So who uses cell phones only? A few folks? iNaturalist cell phone? That's always a good way to go. You can use these for iNaturalist too, but you have to bring a whole bunch of gear. It can be very cumbersome. But there are a lot of good little features. Again, I mostly am an entomologist. I mostly do macro shooting. But there are a lot of good little adapters and clip lenses and things like that you can get for phones these days. And phone resolution is pretty amazing these days. So we'll start kind of talking a little bit about phones and how to control some of the exposure on that. You can shoot collections on phones. It's the controls you might have are not quite as robust as you have with a larger interchangeable format camera. And that becomes especially important when you are documenting collections and trying to retain color value, trying to have repeatable lighting and things like that so that in years from now, collections can still have a process, a workflow to remain digitized and to go up onto global databases and things like that. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of all of that. But as I say, I mostly do sort of field photography. My position in a museum now, we are doing some more imaging at our museum, especially in advance of, we do a lot of outreach and a lot of programming. So doing things like putting together pamphlets, putting together guides for exhibitions. So doing a lot of product photography for those. We just have a 1920s dress exhibition for anybody that likes flapper dresses. We have a lot of beaded dress work. So coming up with a solution to light those dresses that are dressed on mannequins that can then be used by our sort of marketing department to Photoshop into a gallery guide or things like that. So that's where I do a lot of my work. Might not be totally relevant to the folks here that are pure research museums, but hopefully there'll be enough interest here for that. So how many people have done white box photography? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about that. How many folks have done like general specimen photography or are interested in doing that? How many folks are at a museum that has something like that already set up? And how many folks are at a museum that doesn't have that set up but wants to set something like that up? Okay, good. So there we go. We've got a kind of a smorgasbord of folks. So again, I'll sort of breeze through this. And mostly what we can end up doing is a question and answer. If anybody that's watching this online, if anybody is, feel free to drop in a chat question and we can answer those. And we can make this sort of more of a discussion and share tips, share ideas for getting some things set up. I work cheap, so I tend to do all the cheap equipment, and you'll see I have white boxes that are literally made out of foam core from the 99-cent store. So the camera equipment can be pretty expensive. But a lot of this, the nice thing is there's a lot of impetus now for digitization grants and finding some monies available to be able to set up a digitization station. And the nice thing is you can do them relatively cheaply. You can get a reasonable camera, one or two couple lenses, and a lighting setup for a few handfuls of thousands of dollars. That's still quite a lot of money, but that can get you up and going and get a process going. So I'll kind of talk about all of that today, and feel free to interject at any time and ask questions, help answer each other's questions. We'll go from there. If anybody has any questions on a specific photo in here that you've seen, or how to light that, or how did I shoot that, let me know and we can talk about all that. So I'll start with very basics, photography basics. Using an actual camera to light with, or to write with light. That's literally what photography means. And that can be as simple as a cell phone. Most of where I live is in the sort of DSLR or mirrorless, micro four thirds even range. The difference between a SLR, the various types of SLR and like a micro four thirds camera is the sensor size and the reproduction ratio that you get with those. Mirrorless tends to be now compatible with SLR and are basically replacing SLRs for good or for bad. But you're ideally sort of talking about sensor size, where a cell phone camera tends to have a very small sensor. So even if it's a 20 megapixel cell phone camera, it means that those individual pixels are very small because the sensor array that they're on is quite tiny, versus a crop format factor SLR, which is what this is, versus a full frame camera. So the full frame cameras, you'll see those, Canon, Nikon, others all produce those, both mirrorless and DSLR. What that is representative of a 35 millimeter film frame image size. And that was historically moving from glass plate and silver colloid to the first film cameras. They were in sort of 35 millimeter format. That's about the standard view that you kind of see with your eyes. If I took a picture of this room, it'd be about in 35 millimeter format. A crop sensor can get you sort of, for free, can get you closer to organisms, so they're popular for wildlife photography. They might have some complications if you're trying to image large specimens in your collection. You may want a full frame camera that is capable of going a little bit on the wider end, especially if you're mounting that above, trying to get dorsal views of a specimen, something like that. But they all basically do the same thing. And all cameras, even your cell phone camera, even though it kind of doesn't tell you what it's doing, they all work by having a hole, that's the aperture, letting light in, and that goes on to a sensor. That used to be a piece of silver jelloid, then it was a piece of film. Now it's an electronic sensor that measures RGB light levels and photon levels and spits out a digital image. But they're all controlled by the aperture, the opening of that, which we measure in f-stops, the shutter speed, how long you hold your shutter open for, and the ISO, which used to be called ASA, it's a general sensitivity of that sensor to light. So we'll talk about all of that. We're going to talk about lighting, both flash lighting and typical kind of speed lighting, and continuous lighting systems. There are advantages and disadvantages for each, for collection spaces especially. I am used to shooting in flash. If you're not used to shooting in flash, it's hard because you can't see flash. Flash happens for a very quick duration. So it's a lot easier to see the shadows on your subject if you're setting up product photography, something like that, to use a continuous light or have like a modeling light. So you can actually, something like this, you can see whether this side of my face is lit because you can visually see it happening. That's difficult to do with flash lighting, but continuous lighting, even the new LED and the hyper environmentally friendly lighting systems that we have today, they generate a lot of heat and obviously a lot of light, which can be damaging to specimens over time, might be difficult to photograph sensitive materials, paper materials, different things like that in a collection space. So just, benefits and negatives to each of them. And diffusion, though, we'll talk a lot about diffusion as that is sort of the key to lighting. The main goal, if you remember nothing else from this talk, it's to make your light source bigger and closer. The bigger your light source and the closer it is to your subject, the more even that lighting is going to be, the less harsh shadows you tend to get. If you get it, if I stand in front of a bright light, you'll see a very harsh, sharp shadow, and that not only does not well illustrate your specimen, it's also sort of visually distracting. Your images look a lot more pleasing, and you can see a lot more sculpturing and things like that. Depending on the lighting system you use, we'll talk about sort of different ways to do that. But those basic things I talked about, the aperture, shutter speed, ISO, those three things form a triangle that creates your exposure. So a properly exposed photograph will be some middle ground between all of those. And you can adjust one up or down, the other up or down, the third one up or down to generate a correctly exposed image, nothing that's too bright or too dark. So you can see an underexposed image on the left, a properly exposed image, and an overexposed image on the right. If you looked at the histograms, everybody know how to turn the histogram feature on their cameras? We can go into the settings and look at that if anybody needs to. Or you can see this in post if you process your images through Lightroom is very popular. There are other systems available. Adobe has Adobe Camera Raw as a pre-processing software, or any kind of digital negative Lightroom management software that can also then port into something like Photoshop or GIMP or free versions thereof. But all of those will also be able to display histograms. The histogram is just a bar graph basically of every pixel on your sensor going from dark to light. And it shows the amount of pixels taken up by black images all the way through grayscale, all the way to white. Going this way. So here, this image has a lot of pixels that are really dark, basically. So it tells you you're underexposed. Something that's overexposed has a lot of pixels that are really bright. And something that is properly exposed is going to have the majority of the pixels somewhere there in the middle. Most cameras expose for the computer that's in this camera will want, if you let it do its thing, you can take it over in manual mode, and we'll talk about that. If you let it do its thing, it wants to expose for 18% gray, 18% gray scale, which is kind of sort of like that color gray, maybe a little bit lighter color gray, is what you're looking to achieve. There's ways you can control that. On SLR cameras, there's usually a plus minus exposure button. It depends on what mode you're shooting in, whether you're in aperture priority, which on Canon is TV, I think, and various Sony cameras, different things have that, but all cameras will have a aperture priority where you take over the aperture and the camera decides everything else. A shutter priority where you take over the shutter and the camera decides everything else. And a manual mode where you do everything, as well as program modes and sport modes and all those kind of things. I can talk about those. Basically, what you want to do is never use program or sport or macro mode, anything like that. They all suck for various reasons. I usually shoot in aperture priority mode. And when you're doing image, actual collections images, it's ideal that you shoot in manual so that you're controlling every setting. And it's ideal that you write down and have a management and training for anybody that's going to be using the system, that you have a recipe in place so you can have repeatability with. So you'll also see focus lock buttons. Those can be pre-programmed to also lock and set exposure. As well as the actual focus of the image. I can talk about all that more in detail. If you're using a cell phone camera, you actually do have a lot of this control in all of the built-in camera apps, especially if you download a third-party app that will actually allow you get into the firmware and allow you to operate the f-stop and the shutter speed on a camera. You can actually take pretty good night photography images, starscapes and things like that with a cell phone camera if you can get into there and force the camera to hold open for 4 or 5 seconds. But one of the ways you can control exposure on your cell phone camera is one of these sliders that usually has an exposure slider, or at the top left, I have a laser pointer there. One of these sliders that has a little lock mechanism, you can brighten or darken the exposure. The best tip I always give to folks doing iNaturalist, especially when you're doing it on your cell phone, how many people have tried to take a photo of an insect and they've gotten a really good photo of the leaves behind the insect? There you go. Everybody has done it. You're not alone. The best way to solve that is to focus on something close to you. I usually have 2 hands and one's holding the camera, so I usually use my other hand, set the focus to where I know it's close and I can see my lines on my fingerprints, things like that. I go, okay, that's about where the focus that I want to. Then depending on the camera or the cell phone, mine, if you press and hold the focus button, press and hold it, it'll turn into a lock and it will lock the focus at that depth. Some of them have a little lock and key symbol, things like that. See what it is on your phone, and try practicing. Put your phone 3 inches away from your hand, lock it. Then you can recompose. You can take the photo over to your bug or your flower or something like that, and get the actual lock the focus where you want it. So that'll vastly improve iNaturalist photos for everybody out here. And then ISO is another way is one of the ways you can control aperture. ISO, think of just as like a gradation. Low ISO means low sensitivity to light. High ISO, higher sensitivity to light. All other things, all else being equal, right? So you usually see this with night photography, lots of high ISO images for that. Shutter speed is another way to basically let less light or more light into your camera. So all else being equal, you can control the exposure, how bright your image is, with shutter speed. Now, shutter speed has other effects besides just the brightness of your image. If you use too slow of a shutter speed, you'll get blurring in any kind of motion in your image. For most of our collections, most stuff that we keep is dead, so it's not really moving too much, but even a little bit of vibration, shake on a table, any hand motion, even an air conditioner that's blowing feathers or small, scales or something on an insect, on an organism in your collection could blur the image or result in a less resolution, less sharp image than what you're kind of looking for. But you can also use this to your advantage if you want to communicate motion, again, more for living things that I don't know. How many people photograph living things versus dead things? Let's go there. Collections, and then outside in the wild. Okay, that's yeah. Most people do both, so that's good. So this is a way that you can use a lot of flashlighting to freeze motion. Yeah. Yeah. Can you grab the microphone? Thank you, sir. Just so the people on the thing can hear. Thank you, guys.
I'm just curious, like if you're taking photos of a collection which is dead, What would be like a minimum shutter speed do you recommend?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would usually, ideally for if you're just doing ambient exposure, you're not using a flash or any other kind of lighting, probably at least a 500th of a second, something like that, so that you don't blur your images. It depends on the focal length you're using. If you're using a big long lens that has, it's very easy to cause vibration by just moving. You're going to want a faster shutter speed. A wide lens, you could shoot at 1/10 of a second and probably still get usable images. But the other thing it depends on is flash sync speed. So if you're using flash, most cameras max out at 1/200th or 1/250th of a second to be able to sync the flash output. And how that works is your shutter, your aperture on your lens is the hole, the opening on there, but the actual shutter on your image, most cameras these days, with the exception now of mirrorless cameras, have a plane shutter. So the shutter blocks light from getting into the image, and for the amount of exposure that you program in, 1/1000th of a second, however fast it is, you have a lower shutter that starts moving down, the upper shutter then moves with it for the duration of the exposure, and then the lower shutter stops and the upper shutter closes. So you have this little window that moves across your image and allows the pixels to be lit up, right? Allows the photons to hit that sensor. If you're using flash, you can only go so fast as 1/250th of a second, so that in that opening, your flash, boom, fires right there. So your flash fires when your shutter is open. So that's important if you're setting up a photography setup. Oftentimes what will happen is folks will put it on a program mode, or they'll be accidentally nudge the camera and they'll be shooting at a 3/20th or a 500th of a second, and you'll get an image lit with flash, but you'll get a black bar across the image. That's actually your shutter plane that's physically blocking the light coming in. So again, one reason to maybe use continuous lighting, which doesn't have that problem, or to use a mirrorless camera, which we'll talk about. But again, that triggers flash in with a shutter anyway. So you're limited on that. So I would say it depends on the lighting system. But ideally, you're going to have enough light to have something like a 500th of a second. Usually 200th, 250th is pretty good, so that you avoid the flash sync issues. This was taken, for example, technically at like 1/60,000th of a second, because this is actually lit entirely with flash and with low power flash. And I can get into the details and inverse square law if people want to get really in the weeds on this. This was lit with 11 flashes, something like that were all arranged in an array. And so you use each flash at low power, and the actual duration of the light that shines on this subject is about a 60,000th of a second. That's why you can freeze a lot of the motion in the wings and things like that. A lot of the mirrorless cameras now can shoot up to like 1/16,000th of a second, which is enough to stop hummingbird wings for most strokes. Again, hopefully you're not have any collections that move so fast that you need a 16,000th of a second, but you can also communicate some artistry with motion blur. So if you are trying to communicate behavior, motion, using this for an exhibition on ants, something like that, and talking about how army ants drive across, across the forest floor, this is a good way to visually communicate that in a still image rather than a video, right? Which is another way to do it. And finally, aperture. Aperture is the sort of mode that I tend to usually live in, and I let the camera do a lot of the other thinking for me, but I will also take it over and tell it what to do when I want to. I paid a lot of money for it. I want to have total control over it. So aperture is measured in f-stops, and that's the f. Everybody's seen wedding photography at f1.2, whereas most collections photography is going to be done at like f14, something like that, where you're trying to get a lot of detail. I'll talk about focus stacking as well. Anybody done focus stacking or interested in focus stacking? Okay, we'll talk about that. So you have a wide open aperture. The smaller the number, the smaller the f number, like an f2, is a big wide open aperture. The larger the number, f18, it's a small closed down aperture. And it's just like for those folks wearing glasses, if you take your glasses off and squint, you'll see that you can actually resolve a little bit more detail. Same principle here, you're using diffraction to generate a sharper image and deeper depth of field. So small f numbers, big wide aperture. You have a shallow depth field. That's why wedding photographers love shooting at f1.2. Specimen photography, you don't want to have a shallow depth of field. It might look really nice, but you want to have depth through the image. You can also shoot at lower light. It's sort of dependent upon how much light you can absorb into the camera. And shoot at a higher shutter speed when you have this small, wide open aperture, say at f2. A larger aperture is going to give you, a larger f number is going to be a smaller aperture. It's going to give you more depth of focus, but you sort of have the opposite of all the benefits that you get with a wider open aperture. So this is a visual example. This was shot at f1.8. You can see very little depth of field. If I want to put the subject, the viewer of the photograph, if I want to put their attention on that subject, the stamens on that particular plum blossom, it's right there, right? That's one tool I can use to draw viewers' attention to a subject. But if I wanted to be able to count the number of stamens on that limb with image J or something like that, right? I would need to have a shot that's in focus all the way that could use an algorithm to actually count that. Maybe that's important data. Ditto goes for a specimen, and you might be imaging a very flat mammal pelt that's only 1 inch deep. You might be imaging an entire bird specimen that's a foot tall, a eagle or something like that, which plays into consideration for all these different topics. Again, you might want to aesthetically use a shallow f-stop to accentuate some part of biology that you're trying to communicate. This is the turbulate eyes of a mayfly. Nicky Bay is an excellent macro photographer if you want to check out his work. Versus doing something like focus stacking. And we'll talk about that. This Alex Wild is another fantastic photographer. Whereas specimen imaging, we're going to talk a little bit more, and let me see how we're doing on time, because I can breeze through this too if we need to. Specimen imaging, again, is a little bit different. Most folks have drawers of insects, boxes, casework full of large specimens. You might have sections of geodes, sections of, this is a meteorite section, so you might have a geology collection that has a lot of shiny surfaces and facets that you need to light, or something that needs to be backlit. This is actually an SEM image. I won't talk about SEMs, but if people are interested, I can speak to that a little bit. Again, you might have relatively large-bodied or deep-bodied organisms. You might be trying to image a drawer and try to get one photo to automate the process of digitization, or you might be trying to get individual, more product photography of one individual specimen. You might have anybody have other things besides organisms in their natural history collections, such as field journals, notes, archive, paper storage, things like that. Even field packs or somebody's microscope or things like that, right? Those often end up in collections and may want to be imaged for one reason or another. We'll talk a little bit about special techniques and lighting for paper, for notebooks, things like that, especially for assessing the condition of an object to then go out for preservation or conservation. In the case of a journal, right, a journal that's lit from sort of above and has very nice even lighting is nice and provides readability. But in this one image, right, I cannot see the condition of the spine. I cannot see if there's buckling in that paper or anything that needs to be addressed for conservation purposes, things like that. So we'll talk about that. You might have cleared and stained specimens. You might have sort of x-rays. You might want to generate a white background image of a cleared and stained specimen, right? And by and large, natural history collections run the gamut, right? From things that are millimeters long to things that are meters, hundreds of meters long, potentially. Hopefully not that big. But you could be photographing a Patasaurus femur, and then the next day you're photographing a wasp that's this big. So how do you come up with a camera system that can kind of accommodate all of that? We'll kind of talk about all of that. Definitely consider the use case for this. Again, whether you're wanting to focus specifically on digitization, whether you're doing more promotional product photography, a lot of engagement, that kind of thing. Whether you have researchers that are requesting images and the quality that they require for their work. You don't necessarily want to do all your work for them, but coming up with the best sort of mid-range solution for all your images is a good way to go. Image size, where you're going to put these images on deposition, whether they're going for the web or for internal archives. We'll talk about TIFFs versus JPEGs versus DNGs, all the kind of back-end work. Time, budget, and space, those are always bad words. At least one of them is a 4-letter word for collections, right? We never have enough of any of these. So coming up with a system that can fit into what space we do have. Always think about object safety and handling, how you're going to transport these objects, how you're going to set up a studio and imaging center where you will have to bring organisms, bring specimens over to image them, and then return them to their drawers accurately. You might be removing labels, disassociating data from that. So again, just coming up with a workflow so that you minimize those risks as much as possible. It's often good to have a color target, an actual scale bar with a color checker with verified registered RGB values, and I'll talk about some examples of those. Always want to have that in a specimen image. And again, workflow and file storage, everything from the start to the finish of where you're going to manage these specimens. And the biggest thing with a lot of this is basically consistency. You want to, I would suggest, write protocols and come up with an imaging system that's kind of plug and play, and you can have any one of your research team come in, have a visiting researcher come in and use it, whoever you train or choose to train to get that set up. It's best if it's flexible, but can be made to be consistent for any size and shape. So an example of a scale bar here in this herbarium specimen, as well as a color checker. And it has something that has a slew of RGB swatches that you can put an eyedropper tool on in post-processing and really hone your color. Make sure you calibrate your monitors as well if color is really important. But the nice thing is at least if you have a raw file, CR2 or a NEF or a TIFF, anything like that, that has this in here, any researcher can calibrate it to their needs if they so choose. All the information, obviously, in a specimen, as well as a scale bar, is always helpful. There are tons of color targets. Unfortunately, if anybody has a good sort of like cheap-ish one, let me know. There are these on Amazon for like $3, and they work, but the batches are not always consistent, right? So if you order 20 of them for your collection space, they might actually be different enough values that it could make a difference to somebody's research if they're using these for color grading the images. Whereas Robin Meyer's Imaging produces a great one for about $100 US dollars. Color checker passports, I think, are also about $100 US dollars from a company called Wright. And they're good, but they're big and they don't have a scale bar. So what I do is, not in here. Again, remember that I'm cheap. I'm very, very cheap and very low cost. So I just have a metal ruler that I've cut swatches from an Amazon color swatch from and just glued them to this ruler. So this is what I use in the field, especially. I don't necessarily use this for specimen imaging that I would use full time, but this is just like a 10 mil ruler that I can place down on a subject in the field, especially if I'm doing field white box photography, which I'll talk more about what that is. So that works. I just kind of Frankenstein my own version, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are used to doing.
In Japanese, some Japanese researchers are using color chart for the, how to say, dentist. So
that's a great idea.
A very small color chart, like 1 centimeter times 1 centimeter. So
Excellent. That can fit inside a mouth.
Yeah,
That's a great suggestion, using a
to put, how to say, insert box or something like
yeah, using a color checker for a dentistry supplies. That's probably a good solution there. So yeah, we have a microphone. Yeah, no.
Because I work on bird egg collections, so I mean they're
Yeah.
pretty tiny, and the X-Ray now called Calibrite, they actually have a micro version like this size. And it
Excellent.
has it includes like the standard color chart with grayscale and also the ruler. So it's like
Excellent.
everything in a suit.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, definitely check those out. It's finding a good solution has been hard for a while. So. Excellent. Okay, so I just want to give some folks a quick recipe for specimen imaging. This, if you follow this, you'll get 80 or 90% of your images for 80 or 90% of your objects probably. Would work pretty well. If you have a table space somewhere in your collection that you can set up a sort of essentially a product photography studio. You want to find ideally a neutral background. 18% gray is a great sort of standard for a museum collection if you're trying to digitize a specimen and get accurate colors without distracting too much. Most of the photos you see of mine are very distracting because I do a lot of live artistry and a lot of fun pictures. And we don't always want fun pictures for a collection. You want to have consistency and comparability among those. So having something like an 18% gray backdrop, and you can purchase sheets of these from the photo suppliers like you would for a portrait session for wedding photography or things like that. Some kind of diffused lighting. I use this is a small softbox, but you can use something really large like a big umbrella, like one of the big shoot-through umbrellas. But anything like this is for example, a flash head. This fits on there. This flash head, right, is a very small surface. It's a small volume. It's 1 inch by 2 inches, something like that. What you're doing with something like this is you're essentially making your light source larger. This one is about 1 foot by 1 foot. So you at least are an order of magnitude larger than this small point source of light. You're spreading that light out more. So, and then you can scale that up to like a big softbox or a big umbrella, something like that. Having probably 2 of those to have even lighting from sort of a 45-degree angle up and above your subject is typically called Rembrandt lighting, is that angle. So something essentially like this, essentially like a product photography setup. It's ideal, again, if you include a target, something like that ruler, right? You can notice this photographer, this museum worker is not doing her correct job. There's no scale bar in there. What else is not in that photo, if anybody can see that? It's a photo of the object. Unless there's an accession number or something like that written on there, there's no label. So there's no data or no metadata to associate that photo with. I do that all the time when I want to have a clean product photo for a pamphlet or for something like that. But it's always good to include maybe in the background even just handwritten and something you can Photoshop out later if you want to have the product photo. But it's always nice to have something in the physical image. So that way if the file name gets corrupted or you lose somebody fat fingers and types the accession number wrong, you can always see, even if it's a transposed number, the photo will have the record in it as well. Again, ideally, any camera, any SLR camera, a kit lens, if you're only going to buy one lens, is perfectly good enough. A fixed focus lens, something like a 50 millimeter, that's only a 50 millimeter focus, that's kind of the amount of zoom of your camera. The fixed focus lenses tend to be better and tend to be sharper, better resolution, but this can get you started for sure. Shooting in RAW, shooting in some kind of digital negative format, right? Something like f8, something like 200th of a second shutter speed, something like ISO 200. And let me make sure, okay, I'll go back to that slide. Everybody take a photo of that if they want. That's all the information. So if you kind of basically do this, you'll probably get within the realm possibility. And again, season to taste. If you're seeing that is kind of consistently underexposing your images, good audience participation question. What can you do if you have underexposed images with this? What can happen? Can you increase one of your settings? Decrease one of your settings? ISO? Could increase your ISO, right? That would result in a noisier image, but within reason, and you'll probably get pretty close here. So you could put the ISO up to like 400, 800, something like that. You could lower your aperture. You could go to f6.3 or f4 you get a lot more light in, but you'd maybe lose some of the depth of focus in your specimen. And you could use a longer shutter speed, again, with the exception that you might have to be within the range to trigger a flash. And vice versa, if it was too overexposed, do the opposite kind of all those things. So have some room to play, definitely play with it and test it out. And we can test some of that here with anybody's cameras right now to try to control light and see the effects that that has. But that's a good season to taste. That can work for really small images. Again, no data on this, right? A very wild background. So this was for me, for iNaturalist, not necessarily for a collection photo. But you can do this on sort of a white background as well. Generally white background, pure white, black background, pure black, or some kind of 18% gray is usually the best to shoot for. But it can be difficult if you start not having a pure white background, and it can be easy with a white background to too brightly expose the background. You'll get a lot of bleed around the edges of light bleed around the edges of your image. We can talk about that in more detail. Here's a pretty good specimen image, but again, anything wrong with that image? Stuff. No color checker. You got at least a scale bar. That's pretty good. There are some numbers here on the specimen and a label tag. And there is a label tag here, but it looks like there's at least, it's sort of buckled. And you can read some of this, but you might not be able to read the whole remainder of the tag. So again, making sure that you add into your workflows verbiage about flatten the tags, make sure you get a good visual record of all those. You might have a specimen that is 18 inches deep, as it were. When it's laying on its side, it's a very tall specimen. And if you put the tag on the table next to the specimen, you might not have enough depth of field to actually be able to register the details on that tag. You might need to put the tag on the object or higher up, or put a little pedestal or something like that to raise it so that it's all in the same focal plane, or do focus stacking. We'll talk about that. But yeah, just some ideas. Yeah, definitely adding some kind of scale bar or some kind of color checker would help for this. But you can see pretty even lighting, not too many hot spots or bright spots, especially on something that's a piece of metal. Can be a really good litmus test for your images and for your lighting, whether it's too bright, too shiny, things like that. So we'll talk about lighting. Lighting, you want to think about it in terms of quantity, how physically much power you're putting through a flash or continuous lighting, things like that. In here, right, the ambient lighting in this room right now is pretty low. If we turned on the lights all the way up, it would be a lot brighter. So that's just the quantity, just the sheer volume of light. You can also talk about the quality of light, how harsh and pinpointy of a light source that is versus how diffused and soft and wrapping you can make that. And everybody feels that when you go out on a bright sunny day and you see your own shadow is a really sharp outline shadow versus a cloudy day. And if you take a photo of yourself at Disneyland, you always look better in diffused lighting. You have less harsh shadows under your nose and things like that. The same is true for your specimens. We can also, I'm not directly going to talk about color and CRI indexes, color rendering indexes. We could talk about that a little bit. So flash color is important, which can also be controlled with white balance settings. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on that, but we can talk about that. But also in terms of how you actually light your subjects, you want to think about the direction of the light. Again, mostly what we're doing is kind of product photography. You want to have two light sources ideally to balance lighting from both sides of your image onto some kind of background. And there are special use cases, though you want to have some flexibility, where this is an example of what I was talking about, where a nicely evenly lit image of this, I think is a lithograph or something like that, can show the actual image, but it doesn't show the condition of the actual material that it's printed on. And if that is important for your collection and managing your collection, you may want to lower the light. This is a situation called basically raking light. And picture that photo with the shoe, with those soft boxes there, except almost all the way down parallel with the shoe, so that they're just shooting light directly across. It creates a lot of shadow fall off on any kind of high bumps or low valleys, and you can kind of image that, be able to have a record of that you can send to a conservator or work on the condition of that object. So there is, again, flash lighting. There is continuous lighting. And there are some options that have like a modeling light, but that will then actually fire flash for the actual exposure. Those can be really helpful because you can, again, see the shadow fall off in real time and then turn those lights off to prevent heat or excess light for your specimen, and be able to fire the flash. You're gonna want, some flash stands, a diffuser, something like an umbrella, something like that. A softbox, anything in that nature. You can get a gridded softbox. This helps control the spill off of light and definitely play with those different options. You could even really directly control the light with something like a barn door. These are called barn doors, cutters, gobos. There's all sorts of lighting, Hollywood professional lighting terms for all this kind of stuff. And another big thing is you want a trigger, some kind of way to trigger that flash to go. You could either wire this directly into your camera and have it tethered, and you could even mount your camera on something like a Wii Macro stand, if you're gonna have it on a copy stand. And then you could also tether that camera directly into your computer that you're imaging and actually downloading the images directly into a file platform or a database. But if you're doing this more run and gun, it's helpful to have some kind of trigger, and I would recommend getting not an infrared trigger, a radio trigger. Infrared triggers work on line of sight, and so they can often be interrupted just by having something in the way of like a sensor that, there you go. There goes $100. That tells your flash that I can position the flash there, and then when I take a photo over here, I can have the flash still fire, and I can move it around here. Or with something that's radio triggered, I can completely cover this trigger up, and it will still fire the flash. And we can play with some of that if people want to play with some lighting and just get an idea of how that operates and works. But again, this is like the basic setup that you can be going for. Again, adding, say, a color swatch and a measure, and adding some kind of detail on there. But again, that basic lighting was used for this. And again, this is more of a evocative for the public kind of image, showing a size comparison, including a scale, but maybe not a scale bar, maybe something, your local currency that your viewing population will have a tangible relation to see the size of an ostrich egg versus a hummingbird egg, for example. Then we can talk about field imaging. I don't know how many folks are interested in field imaging or able to do some of that. Good, okay, I could have just skipped all that. We could just talk about doing the field. But all of those techniques, all the f-stop requirements, all the camera controls, all of that are the same in the field, just you don't have air conditioning and a nice setup. But you can do a lot of imaging of live animals. This is Clay Bolt, someone to definitely check out and follow. He's a Nat Geo photographer that works on bees. He has a white box table. So this is a piece of like lucite or like white plastic polyacrylate, something like that, that's on a table that he has made out of like PVC joinery, and or like a camping table, something like that, that you can put a piece of white lucite on. He fires a flash underneath to light and brighten up that white, so it's a pure white backdrop. And then he has some clamps and other flash lighting where he will catch wild bees, restrain them in a container for some time, take a photo of them, and then release them. And so he can document, he's getting white background, pure, clean, documented images of wild specimens, and he'll go do this and survey a botanic garden or a nature reserve and do that for the local wildlife agencies, things like that. That's something a museum can be very involved in. So something as simple as like a camp table, having a bunch of clamps, having things like a magic arm. This is a Bogan magic arm. And this thing is like, I cannot highly recommend that enough. That's a thing called, it's got a great name. It's called a Plamp, P-L-A-M-P, by Wimberley products. They make a lot of the Gitzo mounts and the sort of mounts for long lens shooting. But this thing is great. It's Lockline. And you can clamp it onto your tripod, you can clamp it onto your table. It can hold the diffuser, it can hold your subject, your specimen, it can hold the stick that the specimen is on, anything like that. That's always good. Another piece of field kit that can be different and special is fish. How many people do fish photography? Or ichthyologists? We've got one ichthyologist back there. Excellent. Fish are hard, right? Fish are shiny, and they live in water, which is also shiny, and water damages electronics. So that's also hard. So unless you're going underwater and doing like underwater live field photography, one thing you might want to do is you're going to have to, for live images, again, anyways, different than if you have a dead specimen, and we'll talk about light. Well, basically the diffusion lighting can help with anything like, so wet collections, so herps, spiders even that are in wet collection, small things like insects that are in wet collection. It can really help to stabilize them in rubbing alcohol or like a hand sanitizer, like a gelified hand sanitizer that can help stabilize and reduce a lot of the shininess on some of your specimens. Doesn't exactly work for larger fish, especially if you want to have it live. Not always compatible. So these are a couple links to some articles on different imaging systems. There's different ones that agencies throughout the US use, I'm sure globally as well. But you're essentially having some kind of plastic or glass tank with water, usually the source water that you're fishing out of, and you set this up on a bank, and you image the fish and then release them or image them and make specimens out of them. But it might be important that you get good live color in your specimens, because specimens degrade over time, especially color sensitivity will often fade in alcohol preservation. So the sort of photofish system up here has again, this is on like I don't know, an easel or something like that, an actual aquatic tank. They've got a white screen behind it being lit by a flash. So that's all that is doing, is not lighting the subject, that's just making a white background, a pure bright white background that you can then photograph the subject against with a softbox here, and they probably have a softbox out of shot right here, shooting this way, and again, having that lighting from both sides. One good thing to do if you're gonna set up a live fish system is to have a piece of clear, mylar or acrylic, something like that, that you can bend and force the fish to stay up in the tank, because otherwise they tend to sink to the bottom, and then you're photographing the bottom of the tank and all the silicon and the metal that the tank is made out of. If you're doing this with aquatic insects, you can make your own aquatic tank by putting 2 sheets of plexiglass together with a line of like rubber hosing, like aquarium hose pipe, clear hose pipe, and then clamp all around that. And then you can fill that void in the middle with a little bit of water and put mosquito larvae in there or dragonfly larvae, things like that. And it forces them to stay sort of dorsolateral to you and be able to, or sort of be able to image, the sides of your specimen. Oh, using the wrong thing. White background setups. I do a lot of white background photography. The nice thing about this, in my opinion, I like to use these for, again, outreach and for public consumption. These make very evocative images. Everybody's heard of the Meet Your Neighbors project? That's a big global project where the goal is to produce white background, stark white images of every species on the planet, basically, with the connotation that you're taking the insects out of the environment and really putting it right in the face of your viewers. And these can be useful, especially for design, exhibition design, or you can imagine, wrapping text around this snake. You can see if you can generate an image like this where you turn this into a PNG. These are easy to turn into PNGs that can remove all the background. You can overlay text and have it show up through there. You can put these behind text, and you can do situations where you have virtually no shadow on any of these versus having some shadow and like a drop shadow. And so just, again, calibrating the lighting, and I can talk in more detail to the folks that are interested in that. But a literal good way to do this is the one that's at my house. This is as cheap as you can get. This is just literal pieces of foam core taped all together in a box that I can shoot through, right? And you have a little bit of a lip here, and I've added some more paper as well, because essentially what I'm doing is firing 2 flashes, again, on either side, up into the box, and I'm trying to spread that light all around. That's the point of a white box. You're trying to, completely wrap your subject in like get even lighting on your labels, on your specimen, things like that. And I use this for a lot of live image work as well, that I bring the organism into the studio. Yeah, in the back. Do you have a microphone? We can pass back. Thank you.
Can you go back one slide?
Oh.
Can you go back one slide, please?
Uh-huh.
With the beetle on the left, is the shadow true shadow, or is it with the computer?
That's a very good question. You can do both. This one, the lighting is arranged such that this is a true shadow, but you can make a shadow however you want with your lighting. If you really strongly lit it from one side, you get a much stronger shadow, you know, on this side versus on this side. The other way you can control this is to underlight the image, like I was talking about with Claybolt's field work. You can shine a flash through the lucite or whatever underneath and totally eliminate the shadow. You can do this just with raising the global brightness or doing a selection, right, and selecting your image, pulling that off and putting it on a pure white background. Lots of ways to do that. And then you can also, what's very popular for field guides, right? Anybody that's looked at a herp field guide or a fish field guide, anything like that, even the illustrations, but certainly like any photos, there'll be like a cropped out PNG photo that then someone has gone in and with a brush, 18% gray brush or something, has deliberately put a undershadow there. So it depends on what you want to communicate, but you can do it true shadow or in post for sure. And there's lots of ways to do that. This, you can see I've actually got this set up to do mock field photo, where this is a piece of habitat, right? It's a rock from my yard. And I'll show you, I put a spider on this to get a good even lighting of the spider. But the other secret to doing a studio field technique is what the guys at CVS or wherever you get photos printed, they must think I'm a terrible photographer, because every couple of months I send them a batch of out of focus images. I deliberately take photos of nice backgrounds out of focus and get those printed so that I have splotches of color and things like that as a background. And I can physically put that background behind the image and fake that I'm outside. And I get a nice, pleasing background. That's a secret tip. Don't let that leave this room. But I literally have, literally storing all my stuff. Where in here? Always, always, always carry something for a white background. And I have literal terrible photos, terrible background photos that I then use in my images, in my field images. So again, the idea of a white box is you have your subject, you have some flashes firing into this space, and it's illuminating this whole space, including everyone's creepy faces, looking at this Dobson fly. And again, you can get an image with virtually no shadow. Again, you can use these for print media and things like that. You can produce very sort of visually striking posters for different groups that you work for, or for exhibitions that y'all are doing for public-facing institutions. A quick example of the different types of diffusion and visually how that looks and what you can look for when you're setting up your own diffusion setup, your own white box system. A point source of light, like a flash literally on the camera, and you can see that actual flash, your pop-up flash on a camera, or your iPhone flash, right, is a very small, tiny little light source that shoots out bright light. That's reflected, and jumping spiders are great for doing this. If anybody likes jumping spiders, they're fantastic for measuring this element of, because of their eyes, very highly reflective. So you can see this one small point source of light in the photo. If you then just pass that photo through anything, this is a pre-made diffuser you can buy off Amazon. You could literally hold a napkin, a sheet of paper, or if people are wearing white shirts, you can use a white shirt and shoot through it. You'll just get a little bit bigger, more soft diffused eye source. Or do something like going all the way to a white background with those controlled flashes to get this kind of thing. And you can see it in the jumping spider's eyes. You can see how pinpoint that source is. You can get a little bit bigger and more curved and pleasant of an eye shine, right? We're in Japan, right? So all the manga and anime that you see, it always has stars, or you can even make a diffuser into a shape like a happy face and then put it on there. If you want to have your logo, you can get your logo screen printed onto the, AMNH logo or something, and then put it in all your jumping spider eyes. Totally good way to go. Copyright proofing and watermarking your images. So if anyone wants to see that, do a test like this on your own setup. Find a steel ball bearing or a marble or something like that, something bright and shiny that you can go through various setups and document this for the people that you're training to help image these specimens or for yourself. So here's this example of this little Habernatus jumping spider from my yard that I collected from the wild. Photography is hard. Live image photography is hard. Animals don't always want to cooperate. This one was hiding under a rock, right? So I've got the lighting pretty good. I've got everything well. The point of this is that you want to eliminate as many variables as you can. You want to have all your technology, all your camera, your lighting, everything set up. You want to know where all the buttons are on your camera, have already read the manual and have it memorized so that you can forget all of that. And all you're focusing on is watching your subject, watching the spider, where it's moving, when it turns to you, when you want to get that nice shot of it in the front of its face, something like that. So I already tested and got a great photo of where I want the spider to be. There's no spider there yet, but at least I know the lighting, I know I want it there, I've got the background set up. Then you just got to get the spider to cooperate. Usually they face away from you, they don't like the light, they want to show a photo of their butt. And then, you get this great photo that's out of focus. You've totally missed focus, but you keep persevering and keep trying, and then you get, something like that. So that literally came from this process, going from hiding under a rock, getting the setup, getting this going, getting physically closer with a macro lens, getting a little bit tighter pull to get something like that. Where it's looking at you, you can visualize all the CD on the pedipalps. These are important for behavioral studies, for communication. These spiders do mating dances and things like that. They're called the bird of paradise spiders for that reason. So that's a live specimen. Now, focus stacking is a lot easier to do with a dead specimen that's stuck on a pin, right? Or a mammal or a prep, something like that. You can do this with live organisms if you have patience and the organism has patience. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Focus stacking is basically a loaf of bread, right? You're shooting at something like f8. You're trying to get some detail, but also some sharpness in your image. And at that detail, especially at high magnification, this is especially the case with macro photography, it's like looking through a microscope, right? You have such a narrow slice of what's in focus in your subject. One way you can gamify that is to have multiple slices and stack them together to generate one in focus image. So you're taking a part of the image that's in focus, part that's out of focus. You're taking another image of the part that's out of focus to get that in focus, and you're merging the two together to get focus front to back. It's usually ideal if you start at one end and section your way through. It makes it a lot easier on your brain when you're trying to compile these images in post. There's a lot of ways you can do this. You can set up, WeMacro is a fantastic company. They make a very affordable copy stand and various other accoutrements that help with setting a system up like this. This is an SLR system on a set of lenses from Laowa, or Venus is a company that makes a lot of these high magnification type of images, set up on a WeMacro stand. And this is actually a piece of diffusion material that's wrapping around, say, a pin specimen that's in there. And so it's being lit. There you can see one light, and there's another light over here that's lighting the specimen from the side. Same with the white box idea, glowing all that light all around the image. And there you can stack from top to bottom. This will be on a rail that's controlled by a PC or by a Cognisis system. I'll recommend that as well. And you can set the depth stops. So it'll go down 0.013 of a millimeter, take an image, go another 0.013 of a millimeter, take an image, and work your way through a stack of images. And you can do hundreds of images and then stack them into one. You can also mount that on a tripod and go laterally. You can take that out into the field. You could light that. This one's lit with an on-camera system, so it's a little bit more in-house, a little bit more portable. Again, you can get some kind of like a copy stand to do something like this in your own setup. I guess I didn't put it in here, but WeMacro I highly recommend is like $100 and something instead of a copy stand from B&H, and they make a great macro stand. that can be adapted to different rails and different things like that. I was lucky enough to get to tour the behind the scenes of the Field Museum a couple of weeks ago in Chicago, and they have something like 6 of these setups just in their entomology section. This one in particular, they're using as a giga macro setup that's being used to image an entire like Cornell drawer size of specimens. So the whole thing can be programmed to just automate and generate high-res images and as best as you can with label data for just to digitize their specimen collection, because they have 17 million insects. It's a little bit more than we have at the Museum of Riverside by about 17 million. Another really good company to look out for is Cognesis. I think I put a link somewhere in there, but this company produces a lot of very high quality manufactured material for stacking rails, as well as the stacking program, this actual box that will program the steps and fire your camera. It's all wired into the camera. They also make a 3D tracking mount so that you can make 3D objects. And I forgot to put one in here, but Odonata Central, for those folks that are interested in dragonflies and damselflies, has an entire collection of these 3D objects that in a QuickTime player, you can click with a mouse and drag around, and you can see the underside, you can see the sternites, you can see the tergal area, you can see the pterostigma, you can pull it all around in space and zoom in because it makes a sort of giga stack in 3D space. And that can all be controlled with a stack shot. So something like a 3D rendering of a dragonfly. This is a project I was involved with at UT Austin that actually we got the public to fund one of these setups for us by promising them that we would take images and put those in the public domain on Wikipedia. So we have a whole bank of thousands of images of our specimens that allowed us to image our specimens, and then we produce them copyright free for public use on like Wikimedia Commons. So that's a creative way to get some funding if y'all are looking for anything like that. So again, you can do, this is a focus stack of a member acid, another focus stack of a candy stripe leafhopper. Again, looking at like the backgrounds is not really a standard background, not really a sense of scale. But if you look at the folks from, I'll show it in a second, the Ant Wiki page, they have really good examples of these kind of stacks. So basically you're setting up these stacks that you have to shoot in camera, and then you have to put them together in post. So 2 pieces of software that are always recommended are Helicon Focus is one stacking solution, and Zareen Stacker. Zareen Stacker is cheaper, and it doesn't have quite as nice of a user interface. It's a little clunkier to use. I actually kind of prefer it, and it's also, again, I work cheap, so it's also really nice that you can get a institution version for around $100 and student versions cheaper, things like that. But they all basically work by having a stack of images that they have an algorithm that chooses the parts that are in focus and overlays them in a layer mask to stack up the images. And the nice thing about these softwares, you can also do this in Photoshop, but it's a little more cumbersome. The nice thing about these, they have both good UIs to go in, and if there's a hair that somehow the algorithm took out of place and it's out of focus except for the tip or something like that, you can go in and refine those selections and really work the image. And again, the Ant Wiki page sort of does this for a lot of their images, and it includes a scale bar, and you can again pay attention to the lighting in here. This is a pretty shiny insect, for example, and you see a big white patch that might even obscure some of those pits and things like that if that's important to a researcher to be able to access. But they're doing as good a job probably as they can with getting wrapping light around these insects. These were probably taken with one of those, a piece of diffusion material wrapped all the way around the organism. You can do this with live images. I was very lucky to get this tetracephala that was able to sit still and was actually not wiggling its antennae or moving its legs too much. But the idea is, you start with the focus on the antenna, you move your way in slices through the depth of the organism, and then you result in one final image that's better lit and has detail from front to back. You can even then take this a step further, especially if you're looking to do outreach and to do giant sized prints and things like that, with a gigapixel idea. So the same principle here, and this is a pull from gigapixel.com and Gigapan. There are folks doing this where they're generating, terabyte sized images because they're a stack of, they're basically a stitched panorama, a quilt work of images, that each image is 45 megapixels stitched together, tens of thousands long by thousands tall. And you can also take it a step further than that and stack images, focus stack images deep, and also gigastack images laterally and horizontally to create, terabyte size images that are stacked of insects. And that's what we did, not to that degree, but at the Museum of Riverside. And I'll show you a link to a European researcher in the UK that has some beautiful, beautiful images for, again, more outreach type of production. But this is one image of a local butterfly species in Southern California that you can see everywhere in this image has the resolution to be able to see the scalation and the hairs, things like that. So you can zoom around and scale all through these. We ended up using these put all together in mock-ups for a tent wall for when we do outreach. And so there was a lot of good, there's well-received outreach, and you can walk right up to these and they're not pixelated. The reproduction ratio is nice where it's not just a blown up image, like normal sized image. These were some, a couple hundred megapixel images when it was all said and done. And again, you can take that to the nth degree and present these in a large gallery space, and these could be specimen images. You'll notice all of these are missing a pin. So some of these are not a good research specimen. They were either glued on top of a pin or the pin was photoshopped out. It's possible to do that to some degree. And I thought I had the link for this. I'm blanking on the gentleman's name that does this, but this is a UK-based photographer that produces these amazing images. Again, something to just consider is, to reiterate, digital workflow, having something where you have consistent protocol and training if you're setting up a system in your own headquarters. Save in RAW format, if you guys do this. I'm notorious for shooting JPEGs. I do a lot of that for wildlife photography where I'm shooting thousands of images in a day. But for actual, conservation and collections imaging, use RAW, so for Canon, that's a CR2 format file. For Nikon, it's NEF. There's different formats. TIFF works for everything. TIFF is a sort of archival format for that. Rename your files to include the accession number, come up with some system to be able to catalog and find these. Add any kind of metadata, things that can help you later, especially to recreate that image for a different specimen. Something like the lighting setup. Maybe you have a standard Word document name that says lighting setup, and your lighting setup could be lighting setup.doc, and then archive that protocol as well so that everybody can know that they're using the same system. What filters or polarization you might have used in that image, anything like that. Post-processing that was applied to the image. I haven't talked about that hardly at all, but we'll talk about focus stacking. I could talk about Photoshop if anybody is interested in some layer masking techniques and things like that. Come up with a way to do file storage. There's nothing worse than having 400,000 images of your specimens and then losing them in a flood or having a hard drive crash, anything like that. So redundancies, backblaze, something like that, backing up your file storage. So just come up with sort of a procedure to have that in place. That always will save you later. And just a bunch of resources and links here, different things for the Venus Laowa lenses I talked about. That X-Wright color stacker sounds like they have something more. I'll have to get a dental imagery link and add that to get a little color checker for a dentist work. B&H is a US-based distributor. That's what I purchased a lot of our stuff through. This group, C2CC, Connecting to Collections Care, I'm sure folks have heard of them. They produce they're a US-based consortium that produces a lot of videos, tutorials, webinars, things like that on how to properly care for and manage collections. And they have several photography workshops like we just went, you all just sat through here. So if you want to sit through another one, this is a really good one as well. That can give you all those bases. So I think that that's it. I can take any questions y'all have, and we can go back and look at those photos in that other PowerPoint too as well, if anybody has any questions on how to generate images like that. So yeah, go for it. And we have microphones here. And again, I hope we have a fair bit of time left. Yeah, I've got 45 minutes or so. I think we're going until 1, is that correct? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. All right. So I'd like to have an open discussion. If anybody wants to try playing with flashes and learning to control the f-stop and working at that, please, again, come on up and we'll make this a fun share time. So go ahead.
I know it's not ideal, but in the wild, when you're taking pictures of a live jumpy animal like a frog, would you recommend to take overexposed or underexposed?
If you're kind of going to get one shot and then it jumps away, it's for birds, for example, the technique that's taught usually is exposed to the right. So for birds, it's usually ideal actually if you overexpose slightly, if you're going to do one or the other. But you can pull a lot of the highlight detail back in bird feathers if it's too brightly exposed. For a lot of shiny organisms, that can be difficult and can result in a lot of highlights. So I usually err on the side of underexposure for most organisms, especially if you're adding flash, things like that. Most cameras these days are pretty good about bringing up the shadows in post. So if you kind of only get one shot, I would aim to kind of be a little underexposed on the conservative side, and then hopefully you can get multiple images, and then you can refine the lighting and the technique for that. But yeah, it'd be where I'd go. Yeah, and I'll put up. Let me put up my contact info here if anybody wants any of that.
Could you please spend some time helping us figure out how to adjust the settings on cameras?
Absolutely, we can totally do that. We can have a little breakout session here. And something that would be really useful is to set yourself up a grid, and so you can take home and save on some kind of file storage where you say, okay, overexposed, underexposed, F8, F16, F whatever. We'll do all the iterations, and you can see the effects of each change to the resultant image. And then I've also got a flash up here and that can fire off any one of y'all's cameras, and we can work at balancing flash with ambient light and things like that. We can go through that whole process. So yeah, thank you. And we can, I can go through a little bit of a lighting demo here too if people want to guess how that was lit. Front, side, back. This one was fairly evenly lit from the front. You can see the softbox light source there shooting this way. There's my plamp. I love my third hand. Whoops. Oh, I gave it away. How about that one? You can see the bright section here and the shadow here, more light from this way. So this was lit directly from the left, shooting directly that way at the subject with the camera facing this way. How about this one? From the right? There's all the bright areas there. The shadow detail is there, the bright rim light here and the shadow detail there. So being able to look at lighting and assess and say, okay, do I want that in my image? Or, oh shoot, maybe I better fill in some light here. That'll help you setting up your own light source back home. So yeah, that was lit from straight across from the right. How about that one? Curveball. Backlit, back and underlit and rim lit. So this was lit from this little flash, undiffused. And you can see how much a light source like this that's diffused can give sort of even lighting and even spread of light on the stem, versus a small light source that's not diffused gives a much harsher backlight in this case. And then what I wanted to do was merge a backlit lighting and some harsh rim light with a sort of Rembrandt side lighting to mostly light the image. This is doing the bulk of the exposure, and this is just adding in a little bit of rim light. And then you go from something like this, where you have nice even lighting, but maybe you want to see some detail in some of the hairs, maybe add a spiky plant or something like that, and you can just add that little bit of rim light into there. So just getting able to read light, getting able to see and look and assess. Definitely look at photos that you find pleasing online or other collections and try to ask and go, okay, how did they set up? Where were those lights and where was the photographer standing? And that can be really helpful exercise to go through and do that. So I can kill this presentation. Can we do the other
Sorry, I just
presentation?
got a quick question.
And I'll have that up and playing in the background, and folks can. Oh, good, and we have a Zoom. Okay, let me do this question, and then I'll do the Zoom question.
Thank you. So it's just a quick question about focus stacking.
Yeah.
So if often when we image like very very tiny wasp, say a frontal image,
Yeah.
and sometimes after we use the microscopic lens with DSLR, and then after stacking, we find that sometimes we run into this ghosting situation where the antenna and the legs, kind of forelegs, and overlapping, create a transparent looking.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of a solution?
And these
or
are
any
with dead
recommendation?
specimens?
Yeah. Specimens, yeah.
It's ideal. It can help to adjust your to kind of hone in the depth of the stack that you're doing. That can help with some of the artifacting. But unfortunately, a lot of those have to then have pretty significant time in post manually cloning those out. So if you go through, are you using like a Helicon stacker?
Using a Zerine stacker.
Zerine stacker, yeah. So same with Zerine stacker. You can go in Zerine stacker and use a clone tool and kind of clone some of that out or paint in the areas that are, and there's no real way to do that any better or worse. You can try the different algorithms. You could try DP map or whatever versus the other stacks, but yeah, it's a hard situation to solve. It helps if there's even consistent lighting, and if you again can adjust, maybe you need a bigger step or maybe you need more smaller steps, and you can adjust the f-stop as well. So if you're shooting at f8 and you're seeing a lot of those artifacts, you might want to step open to, like, you actually might want to open the lens to f6.3 or even f4 or something like that and take more slices. Each one will be in focus more versus f16 or something like that. You tend to get more artifacting with the diffraction. But yeah, there's no easy solution. I wish there was, because then each specimen, each image takes 30 minutes on the computer of refining. And so it, impedes workflow. If anybody has an AI solution to that, that would be great. So
Thank you.
yeah, of course. I'll take the Zoom chat. And I'll read this out. Hi, I have 2 questions on Flash. We use flashes to focus stacked images, to shoot focus stacked images, 60 to 100 photos per stack on camera systems that are running all day. I'm wondering how long a flash used like this should last, when we should replace them, and if the color of the flash will change as it ages. That's an excellent question. So thank you. So as you're using equipment, it will degrade over time. The ideal solution in that case would probably be to end up using for one, certainly not battery powered flashes like this. As a battery powered flash, this will only last for, whatever, a couple hundred shots, which won't even be a stack. So ideally you're running on AC power, using a sort of high wattage, high output flash that's capable of producing a lot of power, and you want to shoot those at lower power. So if you purchase a flash that's capable of producing a lot more light than you actually need, that will help put less wear on the resistors and on the actual flash modules. That's one thing to do. And it's definitely worth checking with a color checker, the CRI, the actual color rendition on a flash as it ages. To my knowledge, that's not so much a problem with the actual sort of photophores and the actual light coming out. Where you might run into that is degradation of the actual plastic, either Fresnel element on the front or the acrylic that the flash is kind of firing through, which could kind of yellow over time. So it's worth calibrating. That's another really good thing to think about, is to keep a collection of images from 10 years ago, from 5 years ago, and look at the setup and have build into your workflow every year a calibration check where you check the focus of your lens and make sure it's calibrated to not be out of focus. You check your battery life and consistent flash output, because as a flash ages, it can have longer recycle times. So if you're firing the flash, it takes X amount of time to build the charge back up to fully discharge and fire at the same amount of light for the next flash. And that time is called recycle time. And if you're using low power flash, that can be fast and you can take a lot of images. But it might be that you would need to slow down your stacking software to move and take an image and then give the lights time to recycle. And that can exacerbate as the equipment ages. It's something like that to check on. So yeah, definitely building in some kind of check workflow. To my knowledge, it's not a huge problem, but the best solution is probably buying a little bit more capacity than you think you'll need, and being able to extend the life of the equipment that way. Okay, so I think that's it for the chat. Any other questions here? Okay. Huh?
How do you think about the future perspective of the, how to say, global shutter? Recently, Sony released the global shutter camera. Maybe I think it is very, very good for the, how to say, extreme micro photography, because, yeah, it is, how to say, save the flash power, and also that it is avoiding something shaking or something like that. I mean, yeah.
Absolutely, and you get a lot of the artifacts that even like if you're doing very small extreme focus stacking, if you're doing that with an SLR that has a shutter, you're introducing vibrations, you know, to the whole table. Something I forgot to mention, there's other systems for those looking at focus stacking. There are like Leica systems that are actual microscope, basically whole soup to nuts systems that they'll sell you for many thousands of dollars. But that can be a plug and play system, especially if your group is focused on parasitoid wasps or something extremely small like that. It might be worth looking at Leica or other microscope manufacturers that sell an in-house system. And those tend to work off of continuous lighting without a shutter, like a digital sensor. So mirrorless cameras, like you're talking about, again, an SLR camera has that physical shutter. It's a physical piece of metal that comes across. Mirrorless cameras now have done away with that and do not, some of them still have they'll have a mechanical shutter mode that you can use, but basically an electronic camera, an electronic viewfinder camera will be recording the photons that it sees in and will record those onto the image sensor, directly onto the image sensor. It doesn't need to have a shutter mechanism in that case. So that does reduce vibrations. That has all sorts of benefits. One thing that's at issue, especially with wildlife photography, especially the hummingbird photography that I showed earlier, you get an effect currently on electronic image sensors. It's a little bit better now with what are called stacked sensors, and then it's really good now with global shutters, which Sony, I really want that camera. They just came out with that. There's a few companies that are now making global shutter sensors. The way they read the data, the light coming in, is they kind of read it line by line. And stacked sensors will have, kind of like focus stacking, they'll have 4, 5, 6, however many sections of the sensor kind of activated at one time that can each record the image and stack the image. If you're going line by line, what can happen is you're with ambient exposure, say a hummingbird is flapping its wings, it's flapping its wings fast enough that the motion of the wings flapping down will actually record differently on each line of the sensor. So you get, or something like a airplane propeller, something like that. So you get this effect called rolling shutter. But these global shutters now, Sony has the processing power in such a small camera that it can process that entire 40 megapixel image or whatever, all in one go, all at the same time, and write that to a card. So that is definitely the way to go. If you're going for a mirrorless camera, you could even save up the funds and wait a couple years for other brands to start releasing more of them. There's only a few of them now, but a global shutter is an excellent solution. That's one where you could use continuous lighting. You wouldn't be using sort of flash lighting in that regard, but you would use continuous lighting and have the image exposes all at once globally all across the shutter. You have much fewer moving parts. You get much better rendition. Again, it's not so much a problem with a dead specimen that's not moving, zipping around very fast. But yeah, that prevents a lot of that outreach. So that's, yeah, I wish more cameras companies would start making those. That's like the cutting edge technology as of just a couple of months ago. So, but yeah, that's a good one to look out for. Another reason to buy Sony, right? Instead of, I have Nikon gear. Everybody that does cameras, everybody's a gearhead, right? If you get into photography, everybody, is a Canon fanboy or likes this particular setup. So for mirrorless cameras, Sony is fantastic. Olympus, which is now called OM Systems, has kind of been leading the way for a lot of those, especially for kind of wildlife options, things like that. Nikon is slowly catching up. Canon has quite a good system now. For mirrorless options, Nikon has a lot of terrific lenses, but not a lot of great cameras. And Canon's kind of the opposite. They have a lot of cameras and not as many lenses, at least for wildlife and things like that. Sony has a great gamut. Anybody interested in video as well? I could talk about video and video production. Good that not a lot of people are, because it's a lot more complicated and a lot more editing time and things like that. But for producing content for, again, public facing, videography can be fun. And there are some differences with that you want to look for with image stabilization and being able to accurately kind of render video. Nikon mirrorless systems are quite good at that. Canon as well. Sony has been fantastic for a while. Yeah, so just different options that we can recommend for those. So, good. Question in the back?
Doing the crowd shuffle.
There you go.
So, do you have any thoughts on you'd mentioned before, like mirrorless shutter, or I'm sorry, mirrorless cameras and the electronic curtain shutters?
Mm-hmm.
How I've run into this a few times now. How do you mitigate the banding artifacts that you get with an electronic curtain?
You mean when you're exposing it with flash?
Or even just normal, lights. It seems like
Yeah.
it's really dependent on the lighting type. Like LEDs are pretty ubiquitous now, and you get really bad banding with
Yeah,
LED
and especially
lights.
for video and things like that. Some of the mirrorless sensors are a lot better at sensing the color rendition and the actual wavelength, the like frequency of light that comes out. So if you hold up your cell phone in here, you might get this like artifacting in video. That's one of the disadvantages. I was just talking about underexposing images and then being able to pull up resolution from those. That's actually a situation where it kind of makes that situation worse. You get a lot of banding, where you get these bands of like underexposed and overexposed, so it looks like striping almost, like somebody's put a 10% layer on your image of stripes, black and white stripes. In that case, underexposing tends to exacerbate that, tends to make that worse. So that's a situation where I would overexpose, or I would bring up the shadow areas with additional lighting, something like that underneath. Again, it's not something, to my knowledge, that can be like mitigated from a mechanics standpoint, or from you're kind of stuck with that with especially the curtain shutter sensors and cameras. But yeah, trying to address the lighting to have fewer shadow areas, or have more, at least some exposure in those deep shadow areas, or to have those shadow areas be like pure black. But it's those like in between grounds where it's sort of low exposed that you tend to see the banding for the most part.
Right.
Yeah, again, I don't have a great solution for like the actual shooting mechanics to how to mitigate that, but lighting can be a bit of a Band-Aid.
Gotcha. So
or
use a mechanical shutter. Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Or buy a global shutter, things like that. So yeah, exactly. If you know who to do that from, let me know, because I'd like to do that too. So cool. We can do some hands-on. I can have people play with and trigger the flash if they want to. Anybody have any like camera questions, that they have a camera on their hand and how do I change a button or do a thing like that? Anything in particular, or we can sit and play with some things? We can get a group of folks together, if any of y'all have discussions you want to have with each other, share tips and things like that. This was the bulk of the presentation, but yeah. So, go for it.
I basically don't know how to adjust the settings on my camera.
I'll go through. There you go. I'll try to. I don't have any direct examples on the PowerPoint. But what I can go through and talk about are, on most cameras, can we do the lights? Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it. So most SLR cameras are going to have, your grip, where your shutter is. You're going to have different buttons here for video recording, ISO, anything like that. A lot of them have these dials, command dials, on the front or on the back. And then a lot of them have like some kind of big dial, usually up here on the top. And that usually will have what's called PSAM settings. So P is for programmed automatic setting, A is for aperture, S is for shutter, M is for manual. Or in Canon, again, it's like the TV, AV, M settings, different things like that. Does anybody have something like that? So a good exercise is to really screw your camera up. And don't worry, we can always get back to the original settings. The easiest way to do that, if you always shoot in like programmed auto, or you just kind of turn the camera on and shoot, is to just put it back in programmed auto when we're done. But for now, we're going to go on a wild ride. Go ahead, and anybody that has a camera on them, go ahead and put it in manual mode in the M setting. And you should be able, usually you can put a display readout on the back, or you might have to look through the viewfinder, or like on mine, for example, it has a little window thing here where you can see what the settings actually are. Go ahead and go ahead and put it in manual and see if you can play with like your dials or the up and down settings. See if you can take over your aperture control, which is the f-stop, and your shutter speed and your ISO. And everybody go ahead and help out. And also those folks with iPhones that want to try this with the iPhones, go ahead and take those out as well. And you can try to find your exposure slider on your phone. You should be able to have a little lock slider that you can hold the image up, get it in focus, and then you can brighten or darken your image. And go ahead and take a series of photos where you get a dark image, a well-exposed image, and a bright image. And play with like the focus lock. See if you guys want to, I don't have any examples here, but could get a little, yeah, the iPhone, there should be am I still connected to, or can we do the second presentation? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there should be a slider on those. And it should look something like a plus minus button. Most of them have that built in. And then, for anyone that has a big camera, arigato gozaimasu. So something that looks like these. Oops, there you go. So anything like these settings, like a little slider bar here, a lock sensor. Again, you might be able to press and lock and test out, can you focus on one thing? And then with the focus locked, move to something else and image that. And on your SLR cameras, there's going to be an exposure button. Here I'm in, I probably can't see that, but on my screen it says M. It's got a manual mode. So I can control with one of my dials, I can control the shutter speed. With the other dial, I can control the aperture. And then you can also have an ISO button. So a good exercise would be to lock everyone with a big camera, lock the ISO at like 200, ISO 200 or ISO 400, and then take a series of photos just of this room at whatever your lowest setting is, call it F4 or F5.6, something like that, and a 200th of a second exposure, and just see what that looks like. Then keep the ISO and the shutter speed the same, but go to F8, and then F11, and then F16, and get a series of those images. Then go ahead and do the same thing fixed at F8, but do that at 1/10 of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/1000th of a second. And you'll set up a grid where you can see all the different components and how the focus depth of field changes, but also mostly just the exposure changes. So we're able to find your manual setting. Come on up here and everybody can share with each other and we'll just do a free for all. So there's probably a ISO button, or you may have to go into the menu. So if you press, and then go to ISO sensitivity setting. There you go. and then you can change it directly and put it at, lock it in at 200, and then try to do, and also make sure that you are, this one that says auto, or auto ISO sensitivity, turn that off for the purposes of this, because right now we're gonna take over control of that. So this is a question about ISO sensitivity for anybody that's still watching. Oh, and nobody's joined the chat, so whatever. I'll try to talk as close to the microphone as we can. But for ISO sensitivity settings, if you have them set to auto, the camera will decide what ISO to shoot for to keep a minimum shutter speed. For now, we're gonna break that. We're gonna take control over that. So turn it off and leave it locked at ISO 200, and then back out of there, and we'll go into manual mode and shoot at those combinations of, say at f8, but shoot at 1/10. Oh, thank you. Stay at 1/10 of a shot, or of a shutter speed, and then 1/100th, and then 1/1000th, things like that. And so try to lock that in and take a few images like that. Same with you. You have the manual.
So, yeah, it's not manual. This is my vacation.
Just anything. Just and do something consistent so you're just getting the exposure levels. So just pick a wall or something like that, and just see if you get a low exposure, higher exposure, higher exposure.
So the only thing we change is the exposure here.
Yeah, so you're locking at ISO 200. Stay at 1/200th of a second. Stay at f3.5. But then change the shutter speed. So do like 1/10th, 1/200th, 1/500th, 1/1000th. Just change it and see what effects it has on your images. So if you can get into and control that.
So this isn't my work camera, which is more like those.
I've been doing that all day.
So I'm not sure that I can.
Yeah, this one's gonna be a little more, not as smart as it were as the other one.
So
But
I
you
see
still
this
should have
change.
an M. So you probably have that dial probably controls something.
This one,
There you go, so that's your shutter speed.
yeah.
And then you may have to press down something that looks like an exposure button, probably that button. Press and hold that. That cycles through, yeah. So there you go. So now lock it at f5.6, something like that. So you're gonna keep it at that. Now the other thing is to change the ISO settings, because the ISO will take it over and the camera will try to think for you, and we're gonna tell it not to. So you wanna go probably into info, or into some kind of probably menu setting. And you're probably gonna have to go into specifically the ISO settings. Because this is the thing, the cameras are really good at trying to do everything for you, and wanting to keep you in the same mode. So if you find it's probably gonna be in this camera menu with like the shooting setting, that one, yeah. And so then if you go scroll through those to ISO speed settings, turn off auto. So click on that and say there should be, you can force it to like 200. There you go, and click on that. Okay, now back out, go all the way back, click menu, or get the heck out of there. Back to, there you go, all right. So now it's telling you, right? So now hit your exposure button again, and it's gonna say, okay, 1/60th at f6.3, that's too dark.
Yeah.
But that's good. So you take a photo, and it'll record those metadata settings. Then, without changing anything except the shutter speed, then put it at 1/30th, and then put it at 1/20th, and make a gradation of that. Yeah, cool. Yeah, sorry. So that's why I said, like, try to take a picture of like the carpet or something that's consistent, so you can get, so something you're getting a lot of screen glow and stuff like that. Yeah, so we'll do as best as we can. And again, I've got a flash if anyone wants to do this setting with different flash powers and to try different things like that as well. So.
Because this one is really old, but because now it's shifting towards mirrorless,
Yeah.
I have no idea whether I should get
Yeah.
another DSLR or go into mirrorless.
I'm right in there myself. I just purchased a Nikon mirrorless, the Z6 III, and I love it for certain things. I am much more happy with my D500 for other things. So it just kind of all depends. It depends on what you shoot for the most part. The mirrorless cameras these days, the focus, the autofocus setup is so good. It's amazing how quickly it tracks things, and if you're photographing wildlife or things like that.
Yeah, like birds that fly.
Yeah.
Is that better?
That's much better. The new cameras, the mirrorless cameras, are much better at tracking that. For something where you're just doing all manual photography, like a lot of macro photos, I know professional macro photographers that work with a Pentax camera from like 2007, and it still is great. And you just put a good lens on it, and it's so. But for something where you get a little more technology, if you're in the Nikon system, the best one probably right now would be the Z6 III. If you don't want to spend $5,000, $6,000. The best one is the Z9 and the Z8, but those are expensive. The Z50 is not bad and would probably be sort of equivalent to something like that. The Z50, that's quite a good camera, and it's only $1,000 US, something like that. But you would have to then get the adapter, which is this one, and that's a couple $100. But then you can mount different lenses. Now, the mirrorless lenses tend to work slower with the SLR lenses. The mirrorless camera's autofocus isn't always perfect, and there can be crosstalk issues through this. So it's ideal if you're going to go to mirrorless to at least get a mirrorless lens that you can also shoot with. The future is mirrorless, kind of fortunately or unfortunately for me. I'm a dinosaur. I have all the SLRs and things like that. That's where things are going in the future. But yeah, I still enjoy my mirrorless cameras. You can get them reasonably cheap, and you can get old lenses and things for that. So I'm still kind of holding off for a little bit, but especially for the birds in flight focus, things like that. I forgot my camera is back in the vehicle, but just yesterday afternoon I was photographing swallows out on the point, out on Tropical Beach, and it was amazing. I was able to get them and hold the focus in them as they were moving around. I got some great shots of them banking and doing this kind of stuff. And that's a lot harder to do with a camera with a slower autofocus system. And unless you put it in manual focus and really try to track those things. And there's a lot of ways you can kind of game that, but that can be difficult. So, yeah. I would look at the Z50. It's quite a good camera. It's not quite as fast of an autofocus as the newer Z camera, the big expensive Z cameras, but that's a good entryway into the mirrorless market for Nikon.
Okay. And would you recommend Canon more than Nikon, because you just said
So again, I'm a Nikon shooter. I almost would recommend like Olympus if you're doing like wildlife photography, because you can have a package that's that big that is the same focal length as my camera that's this big, because it's a 2 times crop factor. So you get like these much more zoomed in shots, but that's not as good if you do wide angle, landscape, or if you do starscape images or stuff like that. But they're still good for that. But yeah, Canon again has much. Nikon has 2 really good mirrorless cameras that are each $5,000 and $6,000. I think is their retail price in the U.S. So they're very expensive. And then they have the Z6 III, which is like $3,000, and it's good. It's very good. It's not quite as good as those top ones, but it's good. Canon has about 10 different mirrorless cameras at different spec settings with different quality of autofocus that are variously cost. So you can get one that's $2,000 US and then still be able to have lenses in a lineup. And Canon has really good autofocusing system. For video, Nikon is, I would argue, better, which was not the case for SLR. For when it was digital SLR, Canon was leading the way on video. But Nikon and Sony have really good image stabilization. You could talk about Sony cameras and recommend different brands.
Recently I mainly changed to the Sony.
Yeah. So it depends. They're all good. It's just learning a different system. If you're used to like the menu system and things like that on Nikon, then there you go. Might as well change for something else if you're interested. Right now, I would say for mirrorless, Canon has the best entry level kind of like all around lineup for sure. But look at the Z50. That's good. And Nikon has the better lenses, or the more selection of lenses. So another good thing with Canon makes a really nice 100 to 500 millimeter zoom for the mirrorless system, and it's lightweight, and it's really good, and it does all the wildlife photography you could ever want, and it's this big, and it zooms out to this big, but it's small enough you can pack and take traveling and things like that. And that's the best all-in-one wildlife photography. Nikon has several wildlife photography lenses that are all different and are better or worse or have different cost comparison, all that kind of thing. But it just kind of season of taste. So right now I would probably recommend like a Canon. You could probably get a used like R5 Mark I because they just released the Mark II. So you could probably get the R5 Mark I for cheaper and get the 100 to 500. And then you might not need anything else for wildlife or if you're shooting birds and things like that. So.
And especially in Japan, the used camera is
right?
Definitely cheaper compared than the foreign countries.
Don't tell me that with my wallet. I'm going to Tokyo after this conference, and I'm gonna.
Japanese tend to change the camera, even though they did not use too much.
Yeah.
So, almost.
Sell it a week later and it's brand new.
It is sold.
Yeah.
I bought used one, but it's still okay. Sometimes
that's all my equipment is used and as good a shape as you can. But oh, that's the dentist. Like, see, that's awesome. Okay.
1 centimeter and 1 centimeter. So
and it's in 10 millimeter or whatever.
Yeah, 10 millimeters.
Oh, that's cool.
And
that's excellent. Can you post that to like the Zoom? I don't, or yeah. So, yeah, you walk up to the camera and yeah. Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, well, if you walk right up to it and put it on there, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Very cool. Excellent. How are you guys doing? Who's next? Who's we? Yeah, sure.
I just never trust my camera to be smarter than me. So stuff like noise reduction filter.
Yes.
I'm not sure what that is, so just put it to minimum.
Yeah, so that's in body. So there are like post-processing ways that you can reduce noise.
Yeah.
So if you're shooting at a high ISO, you can take it through DxO Pure Raw or denoise filters in Photoshop, things like that. A lot of the cameras have their own one of that built in.
Yeah.
And it's an algorithm, but it's only as good as when they built that camera.
My computer has more compute.
Yeah, it's probably fine, but yeah, keeping it at low, maybe normal is fine, but you're probably going to do your own noise processing anyways.
There's like more stuff like that where it tries to be smart.
So things like that, it's no problem turning that off and
Okay.
That's awesome. Same with like the color mode in Nikon, they call that like picture settings, like vivid or more for that will put a filter onto your image.
Yeah.
But again, if you shoot raw, you retain the raw file.
It doesn't do raw.
So then you gotta I would do like as neutral as possible because then it gives you options later in post and Photoshop and stuff like that. But,
and the autofocus. Always. Okay, there's a bird and there's an insect.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just put it in like the smallest point in the middle.
I tend to use. Yeah, so whole slew of things. I tend to use center point autofocus with a ring of focus points around that will also still. So if I'm not perfectly centered on the thing, it'll still focus. If I'm in a situation more in a studio, like you can see some of these images, something that's really good for live images and stuff like that. For a specimen image, you want it in the center and you want all the detail. For evocative images like this, you want to put your subject not in the center. You want it out in one of the corners and something where it's a little bit off center or you have lines that lead your eye and stuff like that. One way you can do that is by composing like this one is his eye is in the bottom right corner, right? So I wanted the focus to lock on the eye. So I would want to put that focus point, move it down to there. That's if I'm sitting in a stable position and there's no wind and whatever. You can move the focus point around in the image for composition. The other way I'll cheat and do that is to leave it in the center, have it lock focus, and then use the AF on button.
That's what I do, yeah.
In my case, and you lock and recompose. And that works to some degree. The new systems, the new mirrorless systems especially, and these systems to some degree, Nikon, for example, has a 3D tracking system that works quite well for humans and like doing sports where it can track a subject, and then you can move the camera wherever, and it'll just track the subject so you can compose in real time. The newest mirrorless cameras are getting really good at doing that for wildlife and for birds in flight and things like that. The Nikon system that I have, with the wildlife lens and the tracking algorithm for birds in flight, it's insane. I don't understand how it works. It's so good. And it's so, like, I've gotten images that there's no way I would get with an SLR. Like, it's impossible. One way that I try to do that is at least trying to do pre-focusing. So you want to, it's hard when you're like me, it sounds like I do a lot of macro work and then I'm doing hummingbirds and then I'm doing a mammal and then I want to photograph everything, right? So that can be hard. I still tend to use center point autofocus and with a weighted matrix around it. And what you're doing then, though, is you're photographing damselflies, whatever, and then you see a bird. Try to focus on a tree in the distance as you're bringing it up. Just focus so that it sets the camera to some distance that's almost all the way there, but gets you in range. Then at least when you're tracking it with your eye, you can actually kind of see the bird and resolve the bird. And then that's why I tend to use not just one center weighted point, but a matrix of points that's a little bit more spread out. So that way, if I don't have it perfectly centered, it'll still kind of pick up and get it better to start focus rather than just you lose focus and it does and you just miss a shot. Yeah. So if you weight the focus out a little bit, it would probably be.
Because I use manual spot.
Is there an option in manual spot to change the
There's not
size?
manual.
Manual normal?
Yeah, we have a many shop.
That's probably like actually you adjust
Oh,
the.
now I can.
Yeah, and it's still a little bit of like, so the thing
Sure
that,
if this is like the bracketing or.
Yeah, it is.
yeah, what I don't know if it displays it. Can it? I don't know if you,
Yeah, maybe.
will it do it here?
Yeah, of course.
I don't know
we
how
can
to
check the
get it to
property
display
and,
on the thing, but if you,
Yeah,
yeah, there you go. You can make it a little bit bigger.
stuff
Yeah,
can,
that's essentially it. Yeah. If you look through this and press the focus,
recently, many
you can go ahead and
foreign
hold it.
tourists coming to Japan, so maybe
You'll
staff
see there's
also
a
can speak
center
English
box,
and,
but then
depend
there's
on your
dots
request,
around
maybe
it.
staff can-
So it'll be a little red box in there. And so as you focus, you can see it's center weighted, but it's got a matrix around it. So I buy myself a little bit of room. And on the newer systems,
the center.
it'll prioritize the
I
center,
think
but
you
it'll
can
still
check
pick up on
the-
things on the
Yeah, 'cause I'm
outside. So
afraid-
that helps where you're trying to
how
get
to say,
a bird
after
that's behind
supporting-
like twigs and stuff.
Yeah,
and you
I
try,
have a lot of twig bits.
exactly.
And
Yep.
in Japan,
That's
the
so you
subtitle
can.
how to
That's a
say
good
the-
compromise.
the
The newer
use
systems you can
camera,
make the box
so
like really wide or big or something like that,
selling
but
in the
it'll
shop
focus on the
is,
thing that's closest,
keeping a
which
good
is not
quality.
necessarily
Of course,
might be a twig or
buying
something.
from the internet has something risks because
Oh, good. Yeah. Come,
especially the
yeah.
auction is
So yeah, we can play around with some of this stuff. We can play with flash, things like that. Were you able to kind of get over and drive your thing? Okay, good.
Figured that out.
We can now add the flash to it, which is another level of fun.
Flash with camera.
Sure. The first thing you will need is some kind of way of triggering it. So if you don't have, for example, many of the cameras, in fact, both of yours don't have a way to directly sync
maybe
the flash, i.e. a hot shoe. This is a metal contact that has an electronic, it can accept an electronic contact to where it will actually, when you press trigger, it'll tell it to fire the flash. So that one does, for example. Yeah, exactly. So this can be mounted onto that and can fire a flash. Another way you can fire the flash is you guys have built-in flashes. So your built-in flash, you can either use as your flash, as your like primary source, but for a bird that's far away, or if you want to have lighting from the side or something like that, that's not going to be great, right? It's going to have that little point source like in that PowerPoint that I showed, the little bright source. What you can do though is you can use that to trigger another flash. So you can put the other flash in what's called slave mode, optical slave mode. And then what you want to do is you want to force that camera to always flash. And you want to force it to have low power flash. So you would put the flash on, and you would see if again in the menu setting, you want to put it at low power because you don't want it to dominate the flash because you're going to use this other flash to light your subject, right? So you might be able, there's probably a flash setting where it controls the power. It'll probably say something to do with flash. And I forget in the Canon systems, it's probably like, go back to like that.
Sorry,
the,
this one.
the camera
This one is same.
menu.
Yeah.
Yeah, keep going back, keep going back.
This one.
And then, yeah, it's probably in one of these, one of the red settings. And it's probably, again, I don't know Canon systems that well, but maybe in there, go up and down.
Yeah.
See if there's,
This one. Oh yeah.
if anybody knows Canon,
Check the
some kind of flash settings, there you go, boom. And what you want is to tell it to, don't worry about curtain sync, I can explain that later, but You want it to not
Usually,
do like an
recently,
auto zoom with auto ISO. You want to take it over
coming to
and
Japan,
put it at the lowest
maybe
rate.
English, yeah.
And you want to
For
force.
instance,
Actually,
for
shutter sync. Go to
English,
shutter sync.
some
And
stuff
see if you can change it
speak
to be
English
like
and
always
maybe
on.
yeah, they can
First grade, that's
support
fine.
you.
Don't worry about that. I can explain what that is, but don't worry about it. It's not really going to affect anything you want to do. The main thing is we want to just get it to force it to fire the flash, which I guess you did in that the main menu, right? It's force on. So see if.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
1, 2,
Oh,
time.
okay. Thank you. We can exit out here and we can keep doing this in the hallway. Want to do that?
Finish.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah, we're good.
Still now.
Okay.
You stop it.
We can, we're good. Everything can stop. Thank you.
Could you just quickly type the models that you recommend?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And something similar to what I have, because I just
Yeah,
use this
so
for everything.
I would say, yeah, Z50, Canon, I would say like a R5,
Okay.
and Olympus, maybe an OM 1. But,
Okay, and the lens, company lens, because I like to have a little bit more zoom.
Yeah, so,
than
I
the
mean,
P-